Over the years, tax incentives have increased, adopted by the government as a strategy to encourage the growth of the private sector and also boost foreign investment for the general growth of the economy. However, this development has not yielded more results, as Nigeria is said to have lost about $2.9 billion yearly on tax waivers granted to multinational companies. According to a latest report by the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, CISLAC, Africa lost well over $1 trillion to illicit financial flows in the last 50 years, with a yearly loss of about $50 billion. The report also shows that despite the huge loss to tax waivers, the government unjustly increased value-added taxes, which, according to the organization, further impoverished the poor. With the increasing level of tax evasion in Nigeria, analysts also say government must review its tax rules to identify necessary changes in line with global reform. Well, to discuss this and much more, joining me virtually, I have partner tax and regulatory services, Deloitte, Olumide Esan. Good to have you on the show this afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon, David.
Now, Mr. Esan, according to the data we have from CISLAC now, Nigeria loses about $2.9 billion yearly to tax waivers granted to multinational companies. How do we nip issues around corruption, crime and tax evasion as issues of illicit financial flows which threaten our sustainable growth?
Yes, David, first, I think it's important to have the conversation as we're having the conversation now. But also it is important to state clearly that the $2.9 billion referenced, I do not have the breakdown, so I really can't speak to it. But we must be careful to not altogether condemn the entire concept of tax incentives. Maybe you should mention a few examples here. Without the tax incentives offered for the Nigerian liquefied natural gas project back in the 90s, we would never have had the company called Nigerian Liquefied Natural Gas Limited today. Today, that company not only employs thousands of Nigerians, but also contributes hundreds of millions of dollars in dividend through NNPC to the federal government. The federal government also, in the early 90s, had to incentivize the deep water exploration projects in Nigeria, which is why today you have these several big, deep water projects in Nigeria, including Bonga and Agbami and the rest of them today. So I think we cannot just outrightly say tax incentives are bad. And we must go back to the basics. Why do you incentivize companies? You want them to come in, establish, employ people, and accelerate economic activities within the context of your geography. So we must not lose sight of that. And do we still need that? Yes. Today, we're still generating about 4,000 megawatts of electricity. We need to continue to incentivize gas utilization to ensure that companies are able to spend more in converting natural gas into power for our nation. Now, we must be careful to separate what tax evasion is as distinct from tax avoidance. When you provide fiscal incentives, it gives opportunity to companies to plan the tax affairs. They can decide to exploit the tax and fiscal incentives by doing certain forms of investment using certain vehicles. It is legal, it is done across the world. What is illegal and criminal is tax evasion when you go outside of the rules. Now, having said that, we have a peculiar challenge in that when we set these policies, we don't put enough thought through into them. Some tax incentives you set in place should have sunset once the objectives are achieved. For example, we have, the pioneer advantage that Nigerian government grants, pioneer periods to companies. During these periods, 3+2 years where there would not be tax consequences for their actions in the country. But if you look at the way it was set up, it was to encourage either underdeveloped sectors of the economy or sectors which are pioneer in nature. So by the very definition, you will realize there should be a sunset. If I'm encouraging a particular sector and the sector has now become developed, I don't need to have incentives there anymore because the sector is now on autopilot. I think so. What we need to look back is the redesigning of these tax incentives to ensure their continuous relevance for our economy, not outright cancellation or naming and shaming these incentives or these multinationals that are enjoying these incentives to an economy. We have export processing zone across the country. We have Lekki export protection zone. Dangote refinery is coming up there. So you must look at it in entirety and not just actually condemn it for what it is.
Definitely, we have a broad spectrum of issues to discuss here in terms of incentives, waivers, and then those also bordering along the lines of tax evasion. But do you share in the sentiment now, looking at the emergence of a legal framework and the deployment of some sort of electronic register of beneficial owners of registered entities in the country? Some say these are important tools for advancing the fight against corruption, tax abuse, asset shielding, and illicit financial flows. Like you've mentioned now, the agreements between government and these entities have to be stated clearly. We have to know the beneficiaries, isn't it?
Indeed, I'm a fan of that. I believe we should have electronic registers. And even beyond that, we should be able to trace the assets. We should know the individuals behind the assets. And to be honest, I think there are some already good steps in that direction. Now, if you are incorporating a company in Nigeria, you automatically get a tax ID as part of the registration process. So it's no longer a disjointed process wherein, you get your registration and you may decide not to register for tax. Now, as you're registering, you have tax ID. We must leverage technology as much as possible. We must leverage big data, and we must leverage global cooperation. I think, we can speak about that later in this program, but the bit is we are part of an international community. So we leverage on the opportunities we have by working cooperatively with other countries, around us. We have Nigeria now has, the income tax common reporting standard, which is part of, automatic exchange of information program, which was triggered earlier on, maybe around 2013 by the base erosion and profit sharing agenda, which under Action 13 hide this country by country reporting, which Nigeria has also implemented. So with this sort of programs, including the common reporting standards, we can freely exchange information. We can freely track who is moving what out. And it is indeed important to stop illicit, movement of currencies across the borders.
And now looking at what plays out on the international market and the global community, what sort of review or reforms do you also expect to see in our tax rules and systems to meet with global reforms? Yes, Nigeria needs global cooperation, especially with respect to the area of exchange of information to also curb that menace or nip in the bud or don't, or in as much as possible, eliminate tax evasion.
Okay, so, there is a bit you can, as a country, play, reactive, or you can be proactive in how you manage your tax affairs and your foreign policy. I think Nigeria needs to get ahead of the table so our voice can be heard. Recently, you must have heard about the OECD pillars 1 and 2,
exactly,
for which Nigeria is one of the few countries that is yet to sign on to it. Nigeria and Kenya precisely in Africa, and I think 2 or 3 other countries. Now, the thing is this. We had implemented, digital taxation in Nigeria already when we introduced through FA20 the significant economic presence rule, which basically now means that certain big tech companies who would not have physical presence in Nigeria now have a tax base in Nigeria based on that rule that we had initiated. Now, if we sign on to pillars 1 and 2, one of the things that comes with pillar 1 is that such digital service tax will no longer exist. And Nigeria is basically saying, would this leave me better off or worse off in terms of my tax stake? Because if you look at the way pillar 1 has been structured, they're looking at targeting about 100 biggest and most profitable companies. And they're going to say if this company is above 20 billion euros in revenue and makes above 10% in profit before tax, then it falls into this basket. And what the OECD has said is, look, we're going to look at a profitability above 10% margin, and we're going to share 25% of that amount above 10% margin across the jurisdictions where you make money and make it taxable in those jurisdictions. That is the summary of the pillar 1. And and for the pillar 2, they're saying, look, we're going to look at all companies that are making some 50 million euros or over, and we're going to ensure that they pay minimum tax of at least 15% in the jurisdiction where they're making the money. Now, the thing is this: you must ask yourself the question, why are we, behind? Why are we now just fighting? We should have been there at the table when this conversation started. Because if you look at it, I think the fears that countries like Nigeria and Kenya are expressing is that this may mean, lower take, because now we're saying only 25% of the profit above 10% margin will be available to be shared globally. We as Africa, ATAF, which is African, Tax Administration Forum, had pushed for 35%, but what, of course, I mean, agreed now is 25%. We must be proactive because we do not exist on our own. We can hold back for some time, but for how long can we hold back? Because it's like, our world against the rest of the world. So Nigeria must actually, think deeper and actually ask itself the question, we need to take our case to the world before the world brings the case to us. And that is the only way to get ahead of discussions like this. You can ask, why do we even have this conversation about minimum tax? It is because the United States had decided under Biden administration to increase minimum tax to 21%. But they know the economic consequences of that are companies are going to start to run away from the United States if you have a minimum tax of 21%. So what the US has done is to try to force the rest of the world to push minimum tax rate up to 15%. So that if you are looking at, I'm running away from 21, I'm still going to meet 15 where I'm going. You're not so much enthusiastic about running away. But that is because US can think through this and they push the agenda forward. And that is exactly what we can do as a nation. If we can't do it as a nation, we can do it as a continent. Until we get to that point, we continue to be on the receiving end. David.
And now pushing the agenda forward and also taking the first step in ensuring that we have a perfect tax system. Let's also look at the overall tax system in Nigeria. How do you see us now taking the leap in terms of expanding the tax net, ensuring compliance? And you made mention of automating processes. How do we fine-tune this a little further?
Yeah, so thanks, David. First, we need to note that the world has moved away a lot more from direct taxation to indirect taxation. So for most developed world, the process from direct taxation is largely single digit, while the tax proceeds from indirect tax is double digits. We are still stuck in direct tax. And let me give you a very simple analogy, which is not a perfect one. Nigeria is a $440 billion economy. If you take the current VAT rate at 7.5% and slam it on that and convert it, I think it's going to give you maybe somewhere in the region of like 13 trillion. Now, we have a budget of 16 trillion for 2022 proposed. If you can make 13 trillion from VAT, you're almost there. And we've not talked about direct taxation. Now, I know that it's just a rough estimate. We've not considered the impact of, exported, exported items which are zero rated. In other words, which manufacturers can get refund for. But just to give you an idea how much you can thrive on indirect taxation. So all you need to do is to widen the base. Ensure that you focus a lot more on luxury goods. Even a lot of countries have multiple VAT rates. Starting rates, there's a basic rate, there's a standard rate, and there's a premium rate, which you can actually focus on luxury goods, because it is targeted at consumption. As people are consuming more, you're making more in tax revenue, which is not exactly the same thing, with direct taxation. So first, we need to look at the area of strengthening our indirect taxation, and making more out of it. The other thing is automation. We need to leverage a lot on big data. We need to leverage a lot on digitization. The FRS recently, they've implemented, Tax Pro Max, which is that's a, automatic way of actually, technology-enabled way of filing returns and all of that. But you see, we need to do more than that. We need to be able to track returns. We need to be able to track companies. We need to be able to have information convergence in some database that is managed within Ministry of Finance and the FRS. So without leveraging technology, we can't make advancements. Gone are the days where I was told by my parents that you have tax collectors who, block roads, and that's where they're collecting the taxes those days. But we've moved on beyond that. We must leverage technology. Everyone is leveraging technology left behind. So if you leverage technology, you focus a lot more on indirect tax, then you need to actually encourage small businesses. In most other jurisdictions, these small businesses, for one, employ the largest number of people. And when they employ people, these individuals, they pay taxes because these small companies are held accountable for the taxes of those individuals. That is how you grow your tax revenue. You grow your economy, your tax revenue will grow. Your GDP grows, your tax revenue will grow because your GDP is expanding. That means consumption is expanding, production is expanding, and the indirect tax on production, indirect tax on consumption are all expanding as well. So one is not in isolation of others, must have a holistic view.
And talking about the fact that one is not in the isolation of the other, and looking at MSMEs, for example, now, we have the 2022 finance bill expected to be passed along with the 2022 appropriation bill, the budget, which is also going under scrutiny right now. In terms of tax incentives or waivers for small or medium-sized enterprises, yes, we've had issues whether or not large corporates should have more waivers or not. But do you think we should have some level of reconsideration, or what some new inclusions that you would expect to see in the 2022 Finance Bill, taking cues from what we've seen in 2020 Finance Act, 2021, and then an improvement in 2022?
Okay, so thanks, David. I have to comment on that. First is we recognize, we're federated states, as it were, so we have the federal government is different from the state governments, and there's a limit to which the federal government can, force things on the state governments. The MSMEs are struggling with multiplicity of taxes. Okay, they have to struggle with several, state taxes, local government taxes. I mean, this is a big issue for them. If we want them to develop, we must, as a nation, I'm not saying as federal government now, as a nation, we must tackle the issue of multiplicity of taxes. Number two, which is more important to me at this point, is the fact that we have some tax exemptions, okay? We have defined a threshold and defined companies operating under 25 million as small companies. Now, when we set this out, it wasn't, you all know, what Naira is exchanging for $1 now. We must actually, I would say, change that threshold now, perhaps to 50 million, perhaps to 40 million, because, Naira has suffered some setback recently. And so, these companies that should be 25 million 2 years ago are probably 15 million now. So if we want to protect MSME, we must be sensitive to the impact of FXEs on what we define as small companies, as medium companies. So I'd like to see in the finance bill 2021 a change of that threshold, to something by 40 or 50, to ensure that this MSME can actually survive. As definition of small company in Nigeria today, to be honest, should not be lower than 50 million.
And then, Mr. Esan, now wrapping up our conversation.
So they don't have to spend money on filing VAT returns. Sorry, I was going to add so that they don't have to, take on the burden, for example, of VAT and the rest of them.
Exactly. And wrapping up our conversation now, let's look at ways of silencing or bridging the trust deficit we have between the populace and then government. Some argue that taxpayer monies are not necessarily reflecting in the state of economic development or infrastructure we have seen so far, bringing some ease to the economy. You've made mention of multiplicity of taxes. You've made mention of the fact that we need to see automation. We need to streamline the bottlenecks we already have in the system. But really now, going forward, how do we begin to build a trust level between government and then the populace in terms of tax compliance issues here and payments?
David, it's a very big issue. This issue of trust deficit between the taxpayer and the government, it's a big deal, to be honest, and it's one that we should give some attention to. Speaking to different people, they have different views. Some people feel that it is because you're not feeling the heat of the tax, that is why you're not taking special interest in how your tax is being spent. Someone said, look, if you are where I am, where my tax rate is effectively 45%, you will hold your government accountable. I mean, not one or two people have said that to my face, that it's because your effective personal income tax rate, or is it's about 20%, or your VAT rate is 7.5%. That is why you're letting your government get away with more. That if you're paying real taxes, you will be holding your government accountable. I think Nigerians must also come to that point where they hold the government accountable. I know that sometimes the chicken and egg situation. Someone has said, look, let me collect some more taxes and then I'll start to spend more on infrastructure. And someone is saying, look, the one I'm paying right now, spend it, let me see what we are spending it on, and I will be motivated to spend more. So which one comes first? Government wants us to pay more taxes, wants to widen the tax base, and then they can spend money on infrastructure, and we can see what they're spending the money on. But, taxpayers are saying the one we are paying right now, let us see how you're utilizing it. But either way, what is important is, once there's a trust deficit, it's difficult for the two parties to work together. Well, this is my take. Play your role as a responsible citizen. Pay your tax that is due. And, then hold government accountable for how they're spending the tax revenue. Ask questions. Go to, budget, explore, how the states are spending their money. Ask questions. How many of us even know, our legislators? How many of us know the local government chairman and all of that? You must start to hold them accountable. Until we do that, they will not be sensitive to our feelings. They will not take our systems.
Well, it's definitely a good way to leave this conversation here, and hopefully we have government and then our taxpayers and also all the authorities in charge listening carefully. We need to get things better, our acts together, and also see some level of improvement. We need a better tax system, definitely, in the country. Thank you very much for your time on the show today, Olumide Esan. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure, David. Thank you for having me.